I'm Fred Gellert. I teach leadership and management in the Department of Command Leadership and Management upstairs. I will be presenting this afternoon's noontime lecture on trade policy. This is the first of 5 installments in a lecture series we started, I think, 3 years ago now, to add some depth to what you learn here in terms of the economic instrument of power. And so today's is the first on U.S. trade. Others will be the larger economic system for the world, specifics about China's economy and how it works or doesn't work. Then the movie, Too Big to Fail. If you've not seen the movie and or read the book, I encourage attendance at that. That is a very startling revelation as to all what was going on in the United States government during that collapse in 2008. And then finally, we finished the series with a lecture on financial power as a very specific arm of the overall economics. So 5 lectures to help you get a little better depth and understanding of the economic part of DIME. Okay, so I'll be talking trade policy, a bit of the history, who the key actors are in the United States government's activities involving trade, and then I'll highlight some current activities going on. I've been down to U.S. Trade Representatives several times, Department of Commerce, met with a number of the agents down there about how they do their business. It's really been a fascinating learnings for me over the last few years as I've gotten up to speed on how we do things in the United States government. I do want to acknowledge, normally this is a co-briefed with Dr. Joel Hillison. So he and I have built this over the last 3 years, this brief, but he just couldn't be here today, so you got me flying solo. I'll take questions at any time. If you need to ask a question, please hold the button down on the mic and then ask your question so they can hear it upstairs. And then for those that are upstairs, if you've got a burning question, run somebody down here with a note or something, and I'll take your questions. Okay, so there's our agenda as I outlined, a little bit of history, a little bit of who does what, and then I'll talk some current things that we're doing in the trade arena. Okay, so a little bit of history. So this goes all the way back to the founding of this nation. Mercantilism was the prevailing economic theory. Basically, I sell you a good, you sell me a good. If I sell you more goods, I have a trade surplus, and that was a good thing. That brought gold and silver reserves into my economy with which I could do things that I needed to do, build militaries and that sort of stuff. We sought early on and really throughout our history, as many nations do, sought protections for our industries, U.S. industries. That wasn't particularly important in the early stages because, as the Revolutionary War showed, we had significant vulnerabilities at that time, in particular, our inability to manufacture those things we needed to prosecute that war. And so Hamilton came on and began to espouse, and later U.S. Secretary of Treasury, and currently the star of a Broadway play, was a proponent of this idea of protecting nascent U.S. industries to build up our manufacturing capability. At the time, it worked somewhat like this, as many colonies, colonial era relationships, you had unfinished goods sent from the Americas to England, and England sent back the finished goods. Obviously, a little more profit on the upstream side of that equation, and so America was clearly trying to build its ability to manufacture. And in those days, the only source of income for the government was customs, duties, and tariffs. And so it was important for those controls and mechanisms in the early days of the government to have that in place so to collect those as goods came in. Rolling forward to the early 1900s, you had a lot of global trade going on, a lot of booming business. The Great Depression time comes, a number of barriers to trade begin to put in position. The Smoot-Hawley Trade Tariff Act significantly raised tariffs and caused a global rise in protectionism with a decline in global trade, which worsened the depression that would hit in 1929. Global trade fell from $35 billion in 1929 to just $12 billion in 1933. So a full two-thirds loss in trading just in those 4 years. And U.S. trade fell to about a quarter during that same period. Reciprocal trade agreements, as people realized what that was causing to happen for the economy, Congress gave Franklin Roosevelt, the authority to adjust tariff rates, but also the power to negotiate bilateral at that time trade agreements without receiving prior congressional approval. Tariff rates began to fall and economies began to improve. Trade agreements were often linked to peaceful relations, with the U.S. enacting treaties of friendship and amity, but also disputes and disruptions in trade sometimes led to conflict. So a long history of trade among nations, in particular for the United States. Okay, so what are some of the tools we use when we do this? On the left are things that are considered restrictions, and then on the right, things that are considered promotion or enabling trade. So on the left, tariffs. Everybody's pretty much familiar at this point with the current rounds of tariffs going on, $50 billion worth of tariffs on Chinese goods this year. About 818 lines of items came from public and advisory committee reviews. 284 came from Section 301. Section 301 of the 1974 Trade Act says if we prove unfair trade practices in a trading partner, we can then institute punishments or retaliations for that. And so about 1/5 of the lines in trade tariffs currently going on with China came from a Section 301 review that said, so it's the things you can think about. It's the technology items, the intellectual property theft, those kinds of things. This was in response to that. Quotas, an example of quotas. The U.S. has a free trade agreement with Panama, signed in 2007, and there is a quota on sugar and sugar-containing products coming from Panama. So it limits how much and what quantities and types can come in and out of the United States. That's an example of quotas. Trade barriers, subsidies. We, the United States, follow the World Trade Organization's agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures. So we look for places where, in other countries, where the government is subsidizing development, production of goods, which would make the cost of that good artificially low, and therefore would give an unfair advantage for their sales into the United States. There are exceptions to that. One I found very interesting is a government can pay for up to 75% of the research dollars for technologies and those kinds of things. We certainly do that on a number of industries, and other countries do as well, and that is allowed up to 75% under that agreement. Sanctions are usually managed out of the Department of Treasury. As an example, there are 6,300 specially designated nationals and blocked individuals called the SDN list, and about 29 countries or program sanctions. For example, there are a group of sanctions related to cyber intrusions. So when we find, you can pick a few countries that you might guess are inside that, where we have detected cyber badness, and so we enact some sanctions on named individuals and or countries or businesses that we feel are involved in that. But those are managed out of the Department of Treasury. Okay, so those are some ideas of restrictions. Promotion, generally the idea is free trade agreements. You either enter those bilaterally or multilaterally. You set up some rules about, you can trade and there'll be these kinds of quotas or restrictions or not. There's usually mechanisms for how you negotiate and adjust as time goes on, that sort of stuff. Trade adjustment assistance, that is in U.S. law. That exists today. It does not get used a whole lot. It does get used, but the idea of the TAA is to help workers, sectors of the economy that are harmed by trade. So when we were negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership, there were certainly sectors that were going to feel a bite from that. Trade Adjustment Authority exists in law to allow Congress to put some money against education, training, these kinds of things to help the labor force that is displaced by those agreements. Trade Promotion Authority, given by Congress to the President, allows the executive branch, in particular the United States Trade Representative, to negotiate with full authority. You would not want your trade representative sitting in a foreign country doing a negotiation and having to worry about whether each line of that agreement was going to be agreed or not by Congress. The Trade Promotion Authority basically says that it's an up or down vote on the agreement, which gives a lot of authority to the negotiators that are doing that agreement with another country. It lapsed for a number of years. You may have heard of that. And during the Obama administration, it was put back in with a final adjustment to it in 2015. That was the last time that authority was adjusted. And then lastly, government procurement is part of this as well, because what the government procures also affects trade, industry's ability to produce, sell, and those kinds of things. It is another tool in the quiver of the government to manage trade. Okay, who is involved? So obviously the Constitution has several things in it that give legal authority to the entities. So in the executive branch, I've listed there the key main players. By law, the U.S. Trade Representative has lead for anything dealing with trade. I'll talk about them in just a minute. Department of State is involved in any international negotiations. So basically, you've got a USTR rep and a Department of State rep sitting in pretty much any trade negotiation. Commerce deals an awful lot in regulatory aspects. They do participate in negotiations as well. They are the ones that will do things like certify a Section 232 violation, which has to do with national security, and that is how the steel and aluminum tariffs of late were enacted. That came under a Section 232 review out of Department of Commerce. Agriculture, clearly involved in anything with food or farm products. Treasury, as I said, focuses mostly on sanctions and money aspects. And then Department of Defense is involved in anything dealing with military goods, arms, that sort of, often which is exports from the U.S., but is involved in any of sort of that. So Congress has a number of committees that are involved in oversight of trade, foreign relations, Ways and Means, which has to do with taxation, so they're going to do things like import duties, these kinds of things would come out of the Ways and Means committees. Commerce is going to oversee business and trade, those kinds of activities. And then finally, interest groups. So you've got a host of interest groups involved in this, to include foreign entities that lobby and have involvement in the creation, the review, and the commenting on proposed trade legislation. For the TPP, when that was going on and it was in its comment period, I seem to remember it was something like they had to adjudicate 30-some thousand public comments on that, and USTR has to go down each one and see what they're going to do about it, and yep, we'll try to fix that, or no, we won't, kind of thing. About 30,000 of those had to get adjudicated. That comes from a lot of those interest groups who are going to have something to say about any of that. Okay, so the key actor, the U.S. Trade Representative, currently led by Mr. Robert Lighthizer. They are, since 1962, the official trade negotiator for the United States. During the Kennedy administration, he desired to raise the specter of trade. Prior to '62, it was just a subcomponent of the Department of State. Felt it was important to raise its authority, and so created the U.S. Trade Representative. It is a very small organization. They are at just in the building across the street from the executive office of the White House, former War Department. I find that interesting that they're in the former War Department building. So you go in there to meet with them, and there's pictures on the wall of the War Department in the early 1800s. Very small organization, about 250 employees. They're in 4 locations as listed there. They do have the 1974 Trade Act elevated them to cabinet-level rank. They are certainly not a cabinet department in size, but the U.S. Trade Representative has cabinet-level authority and participates at that level in meetings. They put out an annual trade report listing foreign trade barriers. You can find that online. Interesting to look at that, or where they're seeing the trade barriers. And then they sit on a number of boards and panels throughout the year. dealing with imports, exports, that sort of stuff. And their motto is creating new opportunities and higher standards. Mr. Lighthizer is a pretty interesting choice for the trade representative. He is a trade lawyer, educated, was the chief of staff for the Senate Finance Committee, so he served in Congress as a professional staff member, and then served as the deputy U.S. trade representative under the Reagan administration. So he has quite a bit of experience in trade policy development and trade negotiations. Okay, some of the tools that USTR uses. Trade Promotion Authority, I mentioned that already. Free trade agreements, there's currently 14 in use. Trade investment frameworks, these are, so whereas the free trade agreement is the actual agreement of on this date, we're going to start doing this and impose these kinds of things, the TIFAs are the framework of how we're going to develop an agreement. It sets some basic rules for who's participating in the meetings and those sorts of things, what things are on the table and what aren't. Bilateral investment treaties. So besides trade in goods, we have trade in services, but the other is financial flows. So foreign direct investment, you'll hear that term sometimes. So these BITs, investment treaties, are about how that's going to happen. If you are seeking investment in your country or seeking to invest in other countries, the last thing you want to have happen is you invest money and then it get nationalized and you lose any ability to gain from that. And so these bilateral investment treaties set rules about how that is going to work. Then they have multilateral and plurilateral. Currently the only plurilateral, large, many nations is the World Trade Organization. And then there's a list of several that they're currently working, such as the Trade and Services Agreement. You'll hear me several times on the next few slides mention that generally speaking, with a number of countries, the U.S. has a deficit in goods trade, but has a surplus in services trade. So services is things like financial planning, banking, investment work, those kinds of legal services. Insurance is another big one, insuring goods and money transactions, banks, those kinds of things. We typically have a surplus in that. The Environmental Goods Agreement is being negotiated. That is specifically targeting those kinds of products and technologies that are used for environmental concerns. Solar panels, catalytic converters, various hydroelectric power technologies are all involved in getting that set up. And then the NAFTA renegotiation, which I'll talk specifically in a few minutes. Okay, Department of Commerce. 250 people in the USTR, nearly 50,000 in the Department of Commerce. This is one of 15 cabinet departments, a large, sprawling organization, large building downtown D.C., focused on a lot of aspects of the total economy of the United States, trade being just one of them. Both security and non-security related areas. They have one of the things they tout is this idea of commerce diplomacy. So you know we've warmed relations and opened relations with Cuba. That began as a trade issue. The former Commerce Secretary Penny Pritzker wanted to see what we could do about enhancing business trade with Cuba. It began and it expanded, and now you see the relations that we have now in a much wider perspective. That all started with trade negotiations. Two big bureaus that relate to security for us is the Bureau of Industry and Security and then the International Trade Administration. So Commerce, one of the things they do that I found fascinating, talk to them. So any of these arms treaties that we are involved in, chemical weapons ban treaties, these kinds of things, Commerce has to manage the inspections for that. So if you're in a chemical weapons treaty, you have to show what chemicals you're producing, where they're going, in what quantities, those kinds of things. Because the stuff you spray on your lawn to kill the bugs and the weeds and all that is basically the same stuff that gets weaponized if you're going to go down that path. So Commerce is involved in that sort of inspections and controls and has to report those kinds of things. Lastly, just like we have Foreign Service officers who are credentialed diplomats worldwide, the Commerce Department has what are called FCOs, Foreign Commercial Officers, credentialed. They work in a number of countries to do inspections, to do transactions, to oversee our relations with them in trade and economics. And so and they are given the same sort of diplomatic status as our Department of State. And their motto is creating economic growth and opportunity. Commerce Department is led by Secretary Ross. Secretary Ross has a long history in banking and private equity fields. He has been in over 100 companies in 20 countries. He is a services industry kind of guy, which I find interesting because, as I said a moment ago, that is an area where the United States holds an advantage worldwide, and so he came from that sector. So if you take the Commerce Department, USTR, and 19 other federal agencies and entities, they form the interagency that is involved in trade policy development. The statement you'll hear him use is trade policy is interagency from birth. It is not created in the Department of Commerce and then asked to the other departments, hey, are you okay with this? Any trade policy is created in these groups, these meetings and policy committees from the beginning. So everybody brings in their desires, their viewpoints, and then their pieces of the equation about controls, about tracking, about reports, all those sorts of things that they do to make this work. Title 15 U.S. Code. So when you look at some of these web pages, you'll see 15 CFR Code of Federal Regulations, and it'll have some numbers listed. That's pointing you to the sections in law, referring to whatever it is you're looking up. The highest end of this process is the National Economic Council. The president sits at the chair of that council to decide large economic policy issues. Then the Trade Policy Review Group, that's the deputies level type committees led by USTR. They do it in functional areas such as technology, agriculture, those kinds of things. And then the Senior Policy Staff Committee is all those agencies there that work out the various details that they're trying to sift. Another interesting feature of this is these Trade Policy Advisory Committees. 22 of them are sector related, so anything from computer products to automobiles to heavy steel would be in one of those 22 sector committees, and then 4 broad policy committees. These are mandated in law. There are specific members of those committees, and they are charged to advise the U.S. Trade Representative and this policy process on the proposed actions that are being looked at in trade. So it helps keep a level playing field as best we can and tries to keep us from making any drastic errors as we propose changes to the system. Okay, so we mentioned free trade agreements as one of the tools. There's kind of 3 levels of those: worldwide, regional, and bilateral between 2 countries. So let me give you a few examples of each of those. Okay, so at the world level is the World Trade Organization. It's the only one that we have. Came out of the GATT, Global Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, from the old days. It has a number of things in there, such as safeguards. So it's preventing one country from overpowering other countries with duties, tariffs, anti-dumping, these kinds of things. This principle of non-discrimination. So if you offer one member nation of the WTO some sort of favored status, hey, I'll give you a low tariff on a car or something like that, by rules, you are required to offer that to all member nations of the WTO. That is superseded by any regional trade agreements. So if we and the several countries enter into some sort of agreement, whatever that agreement says would supersede the broad rules of the World Trade Organization. And then there's reciprocity. What I do to you, you can do to me, that sort of thing. There are exceptions in Article 21 for national security. We have not used that much up until now. You are starting to see both in terms of U.S. law, Section 232, but also now, as one of the articles of the World Trade Organization, this use of, hey, that is hurting my national security to have your steel, aluminum, pick your sector, rare earth elements, whatever it is you're trading in, coming into my economy. It's hurting my industries that I need to keep at a certain level of capacity, in case I need them for some sort of security issue. Currently, the U.S. is pushing back on the WTO. You've probably read some of this in the news or heard about it. Various things such as, hey, the WTO is not equipped to deal with some of these modern issues. The dispute resolution system is not good. It's not meeting what we need it to do. This is primarily being used in the China-U.S. sorts of arguments, saying that WTO is not able to deal with the issues that we can't seem to resolve. And then in a general disagreement with the system of governance. Remember that when we go to the WTO with some sort of trade issue, it's a panel that adjudicates that. And the U.S. is starting to say, hey, we don't agree with that. That is not what we signed up for, and these kinds of issues. The other one you've probably recently heard is the U.S. has refused to put a number of panel members on some of these panels saying, hey, we're not in agreement with this, and we're not going to staff this thing, which is rendering some of these panels unable to do their business. Okay, so that's the World Trade Organization, the single example of a global organization. So if you look as an example at a regional trade agreement, we've all been hearing the last few weeks, a couple of months, about the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement. This is going to replace the NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement. NAFTA came into law in late '93. Canada and Mexico are second and third largest trading partners, and you see the statistics up there with the trading dollar values. Proximity has a flavor all its own when it comes to trade. We have huge trade with China, but you got to sail there or fly there. We just drive to Mexico or Canada, and there is a ton of stuff coming across that border. I grew up in Detroit, bridge and a tunnel, constant traffic all day long, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week into Windsor, Ontario. Lots and lots of trade going on. Same thing with Mexico. Okay, so the Mexico-Canada agreement, key changes. So it'll come into effect in 2023. I didn't quite realize that. For many of these agreements, there's a period of time before it becomes in effect. And the reason for that is to allow the economies of the member nations to adjust, get laws adjusted, and do whatever you're going to do for your labor force to adjust for the changes. Reviewed every 6 years. That is different. NAFTA did not have a mandatory review period, so that's a new change. There is this thing called Chapter 19 disputes. This has to do with, hey, you put a tariff on, or you created some thing that's charging me money to come trade in your country, and I have a dispute. We're going to file under Chapter 19. We, the United States, were trying to wipe that out. Canada said, oh, not so fast, and demanded that stay. And so the mechanics of that are still in place in the new agreement. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was we backed out of, was referred to as the first modern 21st century trade agreement. It had a lot of things in there about electronic commerce, electronic finance, intellectual property, these kinds of things that are more advanced than some of these older trade agreements knew at the time when they were created. This agreement takes all those same sorts of things into consideration, and so it is considered also a modernized trade agreement. It includes some labor protections in there that the U.S. demanded. It opens Canada's dairy market, which has been very closed to U.S. A very small percent, like 3%, I think, of Canada's dairy market was open to the U.S. It increased that slightly. And then lastly, it had a number of changes to the auto sector. So on the whole, some improvements to the former NAFTA, but largely very similar to what NAFTA was. Not a drastic change in any direction for any of the parties. On the automotive side, probably the biggest change is this idea of rules, this thing called rules of origin. This has to do with figuring out where did these components and how much of this car is American, Canadian, or Mexican. And so it has grown from a 50% requirement when NAFTA started to a 62% requirement to be considered an American car. 62% of it by cost had to come from America. And it's now moving up to 75% as being from the three countries, North America, Canada, and Mexico. And if you look at those charts up there, it may be a little hard to see, but what it's trying to depict is this is just one trade process for a Lexus engine. The engine starts in Tennessee, moves to Buffalo, West Virginia, moves up to Cambridge, Ontario, and then a completed engine is sent down into Indiana, where it's sold, but put then in a finished state into the vehicle. That is just one component. I was told, USTR, one of the reps told us one time that for many of these cars, parts and in whole, they'll cross the border 5 times in their production. And so this gets pretty hard to sort out about exactly where was that car made. How much of this car is Canadian, how much of it is American, that sort of thing. So this rules of origin is tough to manage. But it raises 75% requirement. And then this business, about 40% of the workers have to make $16 or more. That, of course, is a rule trying to both improve but also control the cheap labor in Mexico, right? And so they put this in there, and hopefully will both raise wages for Mexican workers in the auto plants, but then also from that bring some more of the work back to the United States and Canada, by the way. So those are some of the key changes to this. If you just Google this, you get a bunch of hits telling you like what's changed, and you can find the text of the thing online. USTR is required to have all these texts for these trade negotiations online because of the public comment periods required. So you can find all this stuff if you want to start digging into the details. Okay, an example of a bilateral, the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, which is typically called KORUS FTA, Korea-U.S. We've got about a $23 billion trade deficit with Korea. Not huge, but certainly there. Started in 2006 and entered into force in 2012. You find that with many of these agreements, it takes years to conclude these. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was signed by the 12 member nations, we now have removed ourselves from that. It was signed in 2012. Those negotiations with the early countries started in 2004. So when you hear people bashing these things sometimes, you just got to remember that these things have gone on for quite a while. A lot of negotiation goes on for every word in that agreement about numbers and quantities and timing and who gets to do what. So about 6 years to get this into force. And then we updated into 2018. Many of the agreements have specific rules in there about how it's going to be periodically updated and disputes settled. In this case, it was due for an update, and so in March of this year, there was a number of things adjusted in there, in particular about U.S. trucks being sold into Korea. So we have a net deficit of cars coming between Korea and the United States, but we've built back in trucks being sold into Korea. That was one of the changes. Okay, any questions on the actors, the processes, and some of the key instruments that are used? Okay, let me get into the easily digestible current, what's going on with trade, okay? As the line at the front of the slide said, I am not representing the U.S. government. There's a lot of research, looking things up. I'll tell you what I think, but I'm not here to represent U.S. policy. Okay, Trump administration. Fundamentally, the Trump administration is saying that the systems that we have in place worldwide have not been fair to the U.S. economy, U.S. workers, and U.S. manufacturers. That's the fundamental base principle of this current administration's trade policy. There's been market distortions, unfair competition, and there are certainly elements of truth to all of that. China in particular, when you look at that 301 investigation business, has had a number of unfair practices, state-owned industry, state-owned enterprises, subsidies, a whole host of things that are tough to pick out, because they're a developing economy, they're trying to promote their businesses and those kinds of things, all good, but at the same time has an unfair advantage to when we're trying to compete on an even playing field for trade. The U.S. has had a persistent trade imbalance since 1976, and we've got to do something about it. This forms the basis of what is currently going on in the trade world with the U.S. since the beginning of the Trump administration. Okay, so it's a America First trade policy. Here are some of the key objectives. This business of intellectual property is significant. You hear all kinds of figures thrown around about how much value in intellectual property has been stolen out of U.S. Companies and, to a certain extent, the government. That does lead to profit on the other side, because if you can just take the technology without having to develop it, you save all those development costs, and then you start manufacturing and selling it. Now, there are challenges with doing that. You know, they don't necessarily get the whole research. They don't necessarily understand all the details, and so some things do go wrong in that, but they also can make a goodly amount of money in doing them. We want to strengthen the U.S. manufacturing base. There's been a decline in U.S. manufacturing for decades, and trying to arrest some of that. When you talk to some of these companies, some of you in the spring will go down to the BAE plant just down the road in York here. When you talk to them, they have significant challenges finding workers, finding qualified workers, and in particular, finding these welders that can do the very high precision welding required for, in our case, these defense articles such as fighting vehicles. Being able to find those kinds of people has been a tough challenge for them. And that goes industry-wide in a number of areas. Finding qualified workers willing to work in the manufacturing sector has been tough. So, trying to build up on that. It's an interesting change in policy, in my view. For a number of years, the U.S. favored multilateral approaches, such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and bashed China for their bullying tactics of doing bilaterals, right? So negotiating with Vietnam, Thailand individually, these countries, Indonesia, and sort of throwing their weight behind. We, the United States, are flipping now. We are much more in favor of bilateral or maybe trilateral negotiations and less on the multilateral. It's just a different technique. Each has its pros and cons. We'll see how it turns out. And then a lot more use of U.S. trade law. When we enter into a trade agreement, we are signatories to that agreement. Until that agreement is enacted in Congress, so the Senate has to approve the treaty, so our participation in that as a foreign entity, the Senate has to approve that. Many of these treaties, such as NAFTA, have an associated implementation act, for example, the NAFTA Implementation Act of 1994, which is the actual U.S. law that makes it illegal for a company to violate the agreement that we made with those other countries. So we negotiate, we sign the treaty saying we're going to abide by this as a partner nation, but until Congress creates a law, there is no teeth inside the United States to enforce this. And so sometimes this takes time to get that done. This U.S.-Canada-Mexico agreement currently is signed, but is not under U.S. law. It'll be interesting to see what happens post-election, if they can get it through in the lame duck session, or does it go into the new Congress after the first of the year. But to get it under force of law, they're going to have to create an implementing agreement. So the administration is focusing more on those actions and activities authorized by law inside the United States versus those agreements with the WTO. As I said earlier, things like these dispute tribunals, we're using much less of that, and we're just using U.S. things such as Section 301, Section 232 of the 1974 Trade Act, because we're in total control of that. We can do what we want with that, do our investigations, and then place the sanctions down accordingly. Okay, without doubt, China is our #1 trade concern. Just the sheer size and scope of this and a number of issues involved here. On China's side, they are trying to develop their economy into a modern economy. Started back in 1979. We've heard the history of this, lots of finished or making goods and shipping back to the United States. They, of course, want to build into technology development, not just made in China, but developed in China is one of the things you hear them talk about. So it's direct competition with the thing that the United States has had for many, many years an advantage in, and that's that technology development, innovation, creation of goods and services. China's moving into those realms. A number of issues to be sorted out. I've discussed intellectual property. These state-owned enterprises are a tricky subject because as China is a developing economy trying to build themselves up, their government clearly has an interest in certain sectors. And so how do you do that in a fair and equitable way, both to China and to the United States? The goal of the administration is to reduce this trade balance with China by $100 billion. That is going to be a tough challenge. The United States is a spending nation, not a saving nation, especially when compared to countries like Japan. And so how do you do that $100 billion reduction in a way that doesn't disrupt our economy, is manageable for government leaders? States are certainly involved in trade promotion, those kinds of things, and local communities because it means jobs. How do we do all that? That is going to be the challenge for the next years, and in particular as China, and China recognizes this. I mean, I don't think China is sitting there going, we're just going to wag our finger and cut off the United States or whatever. They know they need us, we need them, so how do we work this out to mutual benefit? Okay, so the question becomes, are we in a trade war? I didn't even realize this until I was researching this, that back in January, we put tariff on washing machines and solar panel goods. Washing machines. But somebody got something going on, and so now it's 20% addition to those two products from all countries, not just China, but any countries coming in. That was you can kind of call that the first move. The second, the steel and aluminum tariffs, those were done under a national security reason. While it has economic impacts, it was done under 232, which has to do with national security. And then lastly, these current tariffs we're dealing with China, done partly under the 301 unfair trade practices, up to now at $50 billion total in tariffs, and those were just enacted in June. So a pretty fast development in what some people are referring to as a trade war, all in 2018. The real question becomes, like war in general, where does it go? Once you initiate it, it takes on a character all its own. Where does it end? I don't know what the answer to that question is, but it is something that we're going to have to manage very carefully. Okay, so it's not just about China. By law, the USTR has to give Congress 90-day notice before initiating negotiations, and so they have just, about a week and a half ago, told Congress they're going to begin negotiations with the EU, Japan, and the United Kingdom on each of their areas and trade that we have with them. So, another round of negotiations to see what we can do to lessen these deficits. And with that, I've given you a run-through of a little bit of the history, the key actors involved in the United States government with the trade policy work, and then I've talked some of the current activities going on at both in the global, regional, and bilateral arenas. What are your questions? Sir.
Fred, Andrew Dietrich, Seminar 22. Since the U.S. is also the world's reserve currency, how does that affect us having a world trade deficit, especially in goods?
Yeah. So monetary, I didn't talk much about monetary policy. Or Jeff, are you going to cover monetary policy some in yours? Okay, good. Okay. Monetary policy is certainly a part of this. So this is the idea of valuing and devaluing one's currency and what that does to the cost of goods to be bought or sold in your country. So that absolutely does have a factor in this. As you know, we have accused China of currency manipulation. There are pundits on both sides of that. Yes, they have. No, they haven't. kinds of things. But yeah, I just didn't cover it. One, didn't have a lot of time, but I kind of figured Jeff was going to cover some of that in his financial thing. But it's absolutely a part of this that you do have to look at currency manipulation, currency valuation, because that does affect the cost of goods going in and out of a country. Sir.
How does DoD relay their interests from a cost perspective? My question really pertains to like steel and aluminum. Those are big materials for, say, combat vehicles.
Yes, they are.
So it's going to potentially impact costs on DoD. How does the DoD get their interests?
Yep. So in those interagency policy groups, DoD is one of the members of that, so absolutely in there. Second, anything dealing with both in BIS, the Bureau of Industry and Security, and the International Trade Administration, ITA, those are the two big defense-related ones. We are partners with them. So DoD, state, commerce will be sitting in the meetings together discussing and with USTR, discussing what we're going to do. So we are definitely involved in that. You have at DoD, you've got an agency called the Manufacturing and Industrial Base Policy Directorate under DoD, Office of Secretary of Defense. They are looking at what is this doing to American manufacturing, how do we compete, what do we need to do, those kinds of things. So we Department of Defense, are absolutely involved every step of the way when it has any sort of military, national security aspects to it. Exports, imports of foreign arms. Sometimes we want that, and we have to go work through the controls aspects of that, bringing that into the country, those kinds of things. David, can you hold up?
We have to give the president the benefit of the doubt. He's a businessman. So when he raised tariffs, I have to trust him. It makes sense from economic business perspective. Having said that, though, what he's doing does not make easy common sense to me, at least, if you can help us understand that. Because if you raise tariffs, then the imports would increase the price. And then there are several ways to absorb this increased price. Some of the U.S. retailers, like Walmart, Best Buy, and many other retailers, Dollar General, Family, those kind of, they are now doing something like that. They absorb the initial hit. That would mean they will cut their profit by that much percent, so that they will not translate the price immediately into the shelves and the stores. Well, that is not sustainable if it is long term. And then the other thing it would be to make it up, that part, by our internal production. Well, some of the industries are coming back to the United States, including even Apple. But then it's going to take time. Many will say at least a decade for the United States to manufacture those goods coming to the United States. So it's not immediate. And then another thing is that with higher tariffs, then China will probably reduce its export to the United States. But that can easily be made up by imports from Vietnam, Philippines, and other, or even India. So that's not a big deal. However, the immediate impact would be higher costs on our products. So one may be concerned that we won't have a Black Friday. If not this year, at least the next year, if this is going to continue. So how are you going to explain that? What does that really mean? It doesn't make sense to me at all. But I have to trust the president. He's a businessman. It makes sense to him.
Okay, so let me unpack a couple of things in there. First, I'm confident we're going to have a Black Friday. I have a spouse that absolutely supports Black Friday, and I'm sure we're going to have Black Friday, okay? And whatever that Saturday is, what's the Saturday? Oh, Small Business Saturday, okay? I think we're going to be okay there. But, so I was just down in Houston this weekend for a family wedding. The groom works for Curtis Steel, so I took the opportunity to pull him away from all his friends and family and ask him specifically about what he is seeing in the steel industry. And I thought two things he told me were interesting that I'll add to your question. First, when the tariffs were imposed, it's called hundredweight, and I don't know exactly what that means, but it's their standard unit of measure for steel. Went from 25 cents a hundredweight to over 50. So it more than doubled the base unit cost for steel overnight when those tariffs were announced. Okay. Some of that is now fluctuated back down, but it is fluctuating. And so what that's going to settle out to is not clear. Second, and something you didn't mention, you mentioned about cost, price. The other piece that is now happening in the steel industry and aluminum, I'm guessing, is turbulence, insecurity. So people are waiting on orders. They're trying to, do I drop it now? Do I wait? Is it going to be a better price? And so while he works in a steel, they take steel and make things out of it for other manufacturers. They've been doing okay. He said there's a lot of companies that are seeing big drops in sales because there's this turbulence and people aren't sure what to do. Do I go ahead and buy now or not buy now kind of thing? So that's the other piece to these tariffs, is it upsets what becomes a stable system. So if you remember from strategic leadership, we talked about complex adaptive systems. If you put a perturbation into the system, you're never quite sure how that's going to fully fall out through the system because it is very complex. You cannot see all the end states. So steel, turbulence, cost. Lastly, it is interesting to me, I've never liked the term trade war because I feel like, well, wait a minute, this isn't a war. We should reserve war for that which is war kind of thing. But now as I've gotten into this trade study, I'm starting to realize, it's pretty apt because it is punch, counterpunch. It is, I send my ships and planes, quote unquote, tariffs, whatever, and then you respond to that. You're going to respond in asymmetric ways. In fact, when China was initially hit with the tariffs a few months ago, what did they tariff in response? Soybeans and pork, right? And a number of agricultural products, right? Because where do those hit? Those hits in the Midwest states, Iowa, those kinds of places. Trump country, right? So again, I do not represent the U.S. government. These are some of my opinions, okay? So they knew exactly what they were doing when they put those counter tariffs on other products, okay? And so the response in some ways has been asymmetric to what arguably was done in a logical, well-reasoned manner. Hey, we've got this problem. We've got failing U.S. steel industry. That is a national security concern. There is no doubt, as was asked in the question earlier, there is no doubt about that. So, very logical. We're going to apply some tariffs on this, bolster U.S. production. The response has been asymmetric in some respects. Pretty interesting how that has turned out. So, I do not know what's going to be the end result of this, but it is something that these 19 agencies better be sitting there figuring out because there's going to be more salvos in this. Sir? Hold the button down if you would.
Gets a countering effect as well.
Yep. Okay, so the point just made was that on the aluminum side, speaking to somebody on the aluminum side, their sales have actually improved based on these tariffs. Absolutely. And that is one thing that I kind of mentioned it slightly when I was talking about Trade Adjustment Authority. Whatever you do in trade, I'm starting to realize there are winners and there are losers. The real issue for the government is, what do you do about the losers? The winners are not a problem. They're for it. They're going to agree to it. It's what do you do about those that are losing in the trade negotiation? So, Trade Adjustment Authority is one of those things. It's specifically there to help those industries or sectors or labor forces that are being negatively impacted. You could offer some sort of adjustment in other ways to help either those sectors or if they're being heard in another country, some other sort of thing. So you can try to mitigate a particular thing that you're working on with some work in other sectors as well. Because no matter what you agree on, somebody's going to lose in that. As soon as you allow $1 of sales from some other country, that's $1 in sales that somewhere in the U.S. didn't happen currently. Other questions or comments? Sir.
So, looking at this, so what my question is for you is, do you think that then the tariffs are less about they're always about politics, but less about money and more about putting a dagger into the Chinese heart and trying to force multinational corporations to leave China in order to remain competitive and destroying its industrial base to choke off the money for their military?
Good question. I don't have a direct answer. I will simply say I suspect it has not been that, at least to some level. As I said, this was very much done initially off of a very appropriate, in-law look at, hey, what are the effects to national security? Now, what does it turn into? What does it become as we go through various election cycles and all that? May be a bit of a challenge that we are going to have to be careful about. Clearly, would the United States like to regain a trade advantage against China? Yep, you can just bet that's somewhere in the playbook somewhere. Whether that can happen or not is a big question, because this is complicated, two very large economies. How you would actually engineer that would be pretty challenging. I didn't really answer your question completely, but that's the best I can come up with at the moment. Sir?
Coming to your rescue, I think his comment is pretty to the target. And it is an attempt to force the Chinese to open its market, especially for U.S. Finance, banking industry in China. Because the banking and finance industry in China has been so long just talk, no walk in its reform. And a lot of U.S. Banking, finance businesses have their regional offices in China, in Beijing, everywhere, but they cannot handle business with regular Chinese people. For instance, a Chinese person go purchase a house or a car cannot take loans from U.S. Banking and finance industries. They cannot take U.S. Life insurance either. If China were to open up that part of the market, then it's going to be a huge inflow of U.S. business into China. So that's one attempt to force China to open. And also, these initial tariffs has resulted in some degree of unemployment in China. It has created some problems. So it's actually, as you put it, hurt China to some extent. Okay, although that 100 billion tariff certainly is still, comparing to the 500 billion Chinese export to the United States, still small, just 1/5 of it. But it has this internal impact already. Now, but I still have this comment that since China can provide the United States this affordable, very cheap consumer products to the United States, that to a good extent keep the poor people, low-income people still living pretty comfortably. Going to Dollar General, going to Walmart, they can buy things. If the prices of those products rise up, that's going to force these people go out to the street to protest. So that's very dangerous. I don't know why the president would do that. One more question to that is that out of the 500 billion Chinese export to the United States, and that creates 300 some billion surplus on Chinese side.
Currently 375.
Right. But China spent $150 billion purchasing United States Treasury bonds every year. That means half of the money immediately come back to the United States, spend here. And so then China only have another about 200 billion to do reinvestment and do other things. So I don't know why the president want to achieve a trade balance. It makes no sense because we don't produce those things. Okay. As I said, he's better than me because he's a billionaire. I'm not. I have to give him the benefit of the doubt.
As I said, though, to close off on that, I did not mention the monetary aspects of this. You're now getting into some of the financials about currency reserves, buying these instruments, that sort of stuff. That's another factor in all of this. I agree that as you do manipulations in trade, it will have attendant effects in these other areas. Yep. So you got to worry about all that. Hence why the top organization in this process is the National Economic Council. They are the ones that have the final top-level say on what we do because this cuts across the entire economy of not only our nation, but the other nations as well. All right, it is 12:45, so I'll end there. I will take any additional questions if you have. Thank you very much for attending. I hope this helped illuminate a few things.